Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of Medtech POV, the podcast brought to you by AdvaMed, the world's largest trade association for medical technology companies. I'm your host, Scott Whitaker, President and CEO of AdvaMed. Today, we're pleased to be joined by Lishan Aklog, Chairman and CEO of PAVmed, a multi-product company focused on bringing a range of innovative treatments to market for patients. An accomplished inventor, Lishan also has experience in the operating room, the classroom, and the boardroom, making his insights and contributions to our industry all the more valuable. He was born and spent much of his early life in Ethiopia. He shares a story of coming to America with his family to escape political violence, which has been followed by a remarkable career saving and improving patient lives. I'm looking forward to our conversation. Lishan, welcome. It's great to have you on the podcast today.
Hey, thanks, Scott. Thanks for being here. It's a real honor.
You know, I always like to start these off by giving the listener a bit of a window into who the person is behind the CEO title and where you came from and kind of what motivated you to get where you are today. So can we start there and maybe tell me about your journey as a young kid to the U.S. and what got you into the medtech space?
Sure. I'll give you the short version of that. So I was born in Ethiopia, in East Africa, two pretty remarkable parents. Both my parents were high achievers. My father was the first cardiologist in Ethiopia. He trained in Beirut, trained in the U.S., came back and established a very prominent practice over the years. And then my mother was a very accomplished and groundbreaking woman herself. She was the youngest of 12. All of her sisters, were married and, were not allowed to finish school. She had brothers who were educated in the West, and she became a professor at the university. She got a master's degree at Harvard in the mid-50s and came back and became a leading figure in education, not just in Ethiopia, but around the world. So me and my sisters had pretty big shoes to fill, but also were raised with a very strong commitment to education and to serving others. I came to the U.S. During difficult times in Ethiopia. And for those of you who might be following the news right now, Ethiopia is going through some very difficult times as well. This is in the late 70s, where there was a murderous, blood-soaked dictator named Mengistu Haile Mariam who was terrorizing the country and particularly terrorizing my generation. I was in middle school, and I had cousins who were in college and university who were being, mowed down in the streets and disappeared. And it was it was called the Red Terror era in Ethiopia. And it was a very difficult time. And so most my cousins, my family, but others in my generation were looking for a way out. It wasn't always that easy. Fortunately, my father, because as a physician, you sort of end up having somewhat of a privileged position with regard to how you interact with various people, good or bad. And he was able to orchestrate me and my older sister leaving the country and coming to suburban Chicago, a town called Naperville, Illinois, which I know is sort of almost a metropolis today, but back then was a sleepy commuter town with 30,000 people in it. And we both lived with separate families and just basically showed up as students in high school and went to the local public schools and then sort of went off to college. So we were very fortunate to have a church in Naperville that sponsored us, to have American families that decided to take on these two young Ethiopian kids and treat us as family. It's, we're very fortunate, and, in many ways, it's a bit of the American dream.
What a great story. What you may not know this, Lishan. I knew I liked you, but now I know why. My youngest son is Ethiopian.
I did not know that, Scott.
Yeah, and was born in Addis. We've been back 2 or 3 times with him. A wonderful country, and wonderful people in the country. I've always been struck every time I went back to Ethiopia with, in spite of such challenging circumstances for some, there's a certain level of happiness that just exists inside people in the country of Ethiopia, I've always found. And I love the country and I love going back.
I know I always liked you, but now I know I like that. Now I know why as well.
Yeah.
One of my colleagues, a co-founder of all our companies and my longtime clinical partner as a surgeon, Brian de Guzman, he has 4 kids he adopted from Ethiopia.
Oh, is that right? Wow.
Yeah, they're ranging in ages from middle school now to high school. So that's incredible. I didn't know that.
He has enriched our lives in so many ways. He's now 15. and a ninth grader, and he's not enriching our lives as much as he used to as a 15-year-old. He's a great kid.
He's an American teen, even though he was born in Ethiopia, he's an American teenager now.
Exactly. He's been here 13 years now, right? And so he came when he was 2. He's fully become American. Whether that's good or bad, I'm not sure, right? But that's who he is now. And so what an interesting life journey for you. And it took you to Harvard, right, for undergrad and medical school. Is that right?
Yeah, I was sort of a math geek in high school and, did well in math. I was going to be a physicist. I actually, those who know anything about high energy physics would know that back in the day, before CERN became big, the epicenter of particle physics was Fermi Laboratories outside Chicago in Batavia, Illinois. And I had the opportunity in high school to spend summers there, to work there. I actually got to interact with a future Nobel Prize winner who actually ran the laboratory. I just think back at how preposterous it was that I sort of landed from Ethiopia a year earlier and was sort of rubbing elbows with high-powered physicists. So I had basically decided at that point that I was going to be a physicist, and I was going to study quarks and particles and exotic things like that. And I was fortunate enough to be offered a good financial aid package, and ended up in Cambridge and started studying physics.
And then on to medical school and to become a surgeon, right? So
basically what happened was late in college, I started realizing, I got a B in quantum mechanics, which was, probably the first side of that. Maybe my career as a future particle physicist was not meant to be. But I also, Ethiopia comes into play here as well. I went back one summer, spent time with my dad, my junior, I think it was. With my dad and his colleagues. There was this whole generation of doctors in Ethiopia that had all trained at the American University of Beirut in the 50s. And so the top surgeon, the top cardiologist, everybody was this little cohort of guys, a few women who trained them over a 2-year period and dominated Ethiopian medicine for the next 40 years. So I had a chance to meet, spend some time and said, everyone had always told me I was destined to be a doctor because of my father. And so I sort of conceded that fact. And I had a chance to go to Harvard Medical School. They were the only ones who actually were willing to give me financial aid because I was I wasn't a permanent resident. I had actually at one point given up and decided, well, let me go work on Wall Street for a few years. It was in the era where Wall Street was hiring physicists because it was when the quant era began, and they were looking for people who could do math, and they figured they could teach them the backslapping stuff separate from that. And I was all set. I'd given up on medical school. I was going to go to Wall Street, spend a few years, make some money and come back. And at the very end, after I graduated, the summer after I graduated, Harvard picked up the phone and said, we'll come up with a package to make up for what you did. And so I'm obviously eternally grateful for that as well.
So you became a heart surgeon, and you're probably too humble to admit it, you were one of the youngest heart surgeons to join the faculty at Harvard, I believe, if I read that correctly.
Someone told me that. I guess that I was young. And I was certainly the first African-American in a field that was very much not terribly diverse. I was, again, just very fortunate at the opportunities. I got to train at Brigham and Women's with, Larry Cohn and David Adams and some, leading legendary people in the field. I got a chance to spend a year in Europe training in advanced heart valve surgery in London and in Paris with also sort of legendary folks in the field. So I was very fortunate to have those opportunities, and then go off and become a surgeon myself and have the privilege of opening people up and trying to fix their hearts.
What made you, Lishan, make the change from being a heart surgeon and working on people and saving lives from that perspective, and then moving into the medical technology field that you do now, right, as CEO and a chairman of a board, and so much work that you do in the medtech space? What was that transition? Why did you do that?
So it was a long transition. It actually the seeds of it started when I was a resident. And it became clear when I was a resident that I was very much enamored by technology and medicine. That's one of the reasons I did cardiac surgery. I mean, it's really one of the most technologically intensive specialties we have, with all the tools and the heart lung machine and lots of complex technology that goes into that. And I found myself gravitating towards innovation, towards new technology. It was always kind of in my blood. I received the wrath of not many, but several Harvard professors sort of in the operating room as a bright-eyed medical student saying, why do you do it that way? Isn't there a better way to do it? Have you ever thought about doing it through a small incision? I'd get these glare looks like, I do it that way because Dr. So-and-so taught me how to do it that way 40 years ago. So I had that kind of, somewhat obnoxious young surgeon, budding surgeon bug for innovation. and also for technology. So that started from the beginning. And even throughout my practice, I was very, very active in working with, many AdvaMed companies, large companies, Medtronic and St. Jude at the time, and Guidant at the time, serving on advisory boards, helping develop new technologies, as well as many small startups. And how it transitioned to us actually to kind of saying, well, maybe I'll actually start doing this myself or with me and my partner, was that I'd gotten involved in the treatment of pulmonary embolism, which are blood clots to the lung. And I'd had a cardiologist who said, hey, I'd like to send you patients to do open surgery on patients who have blood clots to their lungs. And I was a first-year attending, and now at Brigham, I was at Harvard. I was, a case is a case. You want to do surgery? So I said, sure. And that was a case that every surgeon wanted to avoid, because usually they're sending you people who are really, have one foot, they're near dead, and you're trying to save them. And he had agreed he was going to send patients at an earlier stage so we could do surgery before the die was cast. And so I got myself very early in my career doing lots of these cases, dozens of cases where typically the hospital would do one a year. And we started getting good outcomes from it and published on it in circulation and started, going around the world giving talks about the surgery. But every time I would do it, it'd be 1:00 in the morning, and you'd have somebody who was helicoptered in, and the resident would sort of get everything set up, and you're on the heart lung machine, you're bypassing the entire circulation. And the operation at that point consisted of, you open the artery to the lungs, you grab a forceps, you pluck out a clot, you close it up, and you're done. And it just seemed like an incredibly invasive, long run for a short slide. And so I started thinking about ways to take the endovascular approaches that had started to come along in other areas. Stent grafts, aortic stent grafts were just coming along, and said, look, there's got to be an endovascular way we can remove these large blood clots, different than typical small clots. There was a lot of thrombectomy devices out there that were doing smaller clots. And I started, filing some IP, and was very naively kind of wandering the streets, seeing who might be interested in it, talked to some companies, just with no really understanding of how to navigate this, but at least started getting the creative juices flowing. And then ultimately I connected with my clinical partner, as well as another longtime veteran of the medtech industry, a guy named Mike Lennon, who was at Guidant. I got to know when he was at Guidant. And we he came to us and said, I have a business model that is focused on capital efficiency, speed to market. He had just spent time at Excellent, which at the time was the largest contract manufacturer. And so he asked us if we would join him as partners. We were still practicing heart surgery. We were in Arizona at the time. And we founded an entity called Pavilion Holdings Group, where we said we would take this business model that Mike handed to us and start advancing our own innovations and potentially outside innovations along this model. And the first thing we stumbled on was this idea on how to do pulmonary embolism procedures endovascularly. And we created a company called Vortex Medical, got it from PowerPoint to first in human in 18 months at Brigham. Sipped on capital, very small amount of capital along the way, got some independent reps to sell it. We were doing a couple of million in revenue, and sold that to AngioDynamics in 2012. So that was kind of at the point at which we just sort of dove in full, but with both feet, and said, oh, this is great. And there's a bit of a long answer, but I'm going to get to one of the points you made about sort of transitioning from the professional satisfaction of doing surgery and saving lives. What I realized during the Vortex years is that you can have, and this is really important for our whole industry, right? Which is that the opportunity to have an impact on lives, saving lives or improving lives through technology is as great as being the actual person to do it. And I recall a case that I did with that I was proctoring at the University of Maryland, a young woman who avoided her fourth chest opening because they were able to use our device to suck the clot out of her heart instead of having to open her chest for the first time. And I was going to go to dinner with my friend who did the case, who was a longtime colleague of mine. And he said, I got to go talk to the patient. He went to go talk to the patient's family. And they both walked out together. And because he had told him, he goes, my friend who invented this thing is with me. And he insisted on coming and talking to me and just sort of, thanking me for, giving his wife the opportunity to have a treatment that did not require the level of invasiveness. So it was that point I realized, you can actually have as powerful an impact, and maybe even more powerful numerically, by doing things on the industry side. That's kind of when the light bulb went off.
That's an incredible story. And it's interesting, you have your own personal story, but as I've talked to CEOs throughout our industry, it's the life-saving, life-changing aspect of our business that continues to motivate everybody to work in this space. I was talking to one CEO yesterday who started in the IT space and was intrigued by the innovation in the IT space for a very large company. And at some point realized that technology is fascinating, but it doesn't change lives the way medical technology does. And that was the leap for her, right? She's like, I want to take all these learnings and then take it over and change people's lives. And you hear that over and over from CEOs in our space, that's really the motivating factor, right?
It really is. It's a unique part of our industry. Like we say, we're not selling widgets. We're not selling apps with birds running around on the app. I mean, we're actually having a real impact on lives, and it's one of the reasons why it's great to be part of this industry. But it gives us actually an advantage. I'll just give you you remind me of one quick anecdote that came up in one of our leadership team meetings today, where we're building up a digital health. We have a digital health subsidiary, and we're getting really deep and active in the digital health space. And we have a very accomplished chief technology officer who we just recently hired out of the Bay Area, and we're talking about the plan to expand her team to include people, technical folks with expertise in machine learning and AI. As you might imagine, that's obviously everyone's doing machine learning and AI. Those folks are in high demand. Right. And one of the things she pointed out to me this morning was that she goes, although they're in high demand, people want to work. They like the idea of working in a space, in an industry, on products that are going to have impact on people's lives and not making cars drive autonomously or something like that. Exactly. And so she goes, I actually think we'll be fine. She said, I think we'll be able to fill up this team fine because we have an advantage over other companies that are trying to recruit these folks. Yeah, there's a mission to what we do. There's a purpose to what we do that transcends so many other areas of business. I think that's what makes us so unique. Let's transition to your current company, PAVmed, and talk about that company a little bit and where you are in your journey there, Lishan. Right. So PAVmed was really, the way I look at it is PAVmed started as the second chapter in this enterprise I had mentioned to you. So under the Pavilion heading, we created 4 companies, single product, a little dab of $3 million of capital on the market, either commercializing it ourselves or selling it to another company. After we sold Vortex, we realized that if we were going to grow this enterprise, so the second chapter had to be somewhat different. And so what we embarked on was a path where we said, we're not going to do single product companies anymore. We're going to do a single entity that's a long-term vehicle that's undifferentiated, that's agnostic to specialty, which is all somewhat odd and contrarian. You'll agree from knowing our industry to say, we're not going to go out and be a cardiac company or an ortho company. We're going to be a value, innovation-driven company that will look at and will innovate across the spectrum of clinical conditions and even commercial call points. So we created PAVmed. We seeded it with 5 of our own innovations that we had been working on, but we created it in a way that we felt would be streamlined with regard to our ability to bring in outside technologies through partnerships with academic medical centers and physician innovators and others, right? Yeah. And then just to be extra contrarian, we said we're going to go to the public markets at a much earlier stage that would be normal. I got connected to a couple of Wall Street veterans who were very much focused on early stage companies accessing the public markets. And so we did that. So we basically decided we would raise capital we did a small IPO a couple of years after we founded PAVmed, and we've raised a couple $100 million over the years and have access to total capital. The whole aspect of this, I think, is relevant to kind of thinking about our industry as a whole. As I said, we decided we would seek to continue to feed this engine, which has now grown substantially over the years, by not just internal innovation, but accessing external innovations that are typically at academic centers or physician innovators, right? And one of the things that's unique about medtech or different about medtech compared to, let's say, pharma, is that the path for some molecule and some fancy laboratory somewhere working its way out and ending up either as an early stage company or with a larger stage company, that pathway is pretty well scripted. There's some good molecule out there that has a prospect for being a therapeutic. It'll work its way through. That's not the case for technology. I mean, there is a lot of technology that is trapped in academic medical centers by physician innovators that are just, they move along, they do some animal work, they get through accelerators and, potentially have some support from the institution, but they're just not getting out. And so we decided we would build this in order to do that. And what we've done in the years is we've acquired or licensed technology across a broad spectrum in 4 areas from 4 different entities. The poster child for that is Lucid Diagnostics, our subsidiary, which just went public a couple of weeks ago and raised capital publicly in the diagnostic space. It was our foray into the diagnostic space for detection of esophageal precancer in patients who are at risk who have gastroesophageal reflux disease. We're in digital health. We're in a variety of other areas. And those relationships with those academic centers or their physician innovators have been creative. They've been sort of out of the box in terms of how we've done it, and they've been win-wins, very different than the standard model.
Interested in the phrase you used that a lot of technologies are trapped in academic centers in the area that we work in, but they're not in the biopharma space so much. What is it that causes those technologies to be trapped? Is it something structural about our industry? Is it something structural about the academic industry, or is it just the uncertainty of what's going to happen with the technology?
I think it's maybe a bit of all 3, but I would put the industry last. I think it's structurally different, right? A molecule is a molecule. You do it's pretty straightforward on how you get that through. In medical technology innovation happens in the trenches, right? It's somebody, I'm the poster child for that. It's someone who's doing a particular type of surgery and says, wow, maybe there's a better way to do this less invasively that could be helpful to patients. Some of it comes out of the basic science lab, and some of it is certainly true translational medicine, like the molecular diagnostic assay we market. But a lot of it is more, kind of amorphous innovation in the trenches. And yes, the academic medical centers are not well equipped to handle that. They're very much kind of royalty focused CTOs that just know how to get the molecule out of there, and some are more advanced than others. Some have big elaborate innovation centers with accelerators and accessing, but even those, just their yield is not what you would need it to be. So I think it gets to the question of, I'm not sure that the industry is really at fault, but it does. We have as an industry, we do have an interest in making sure that these innovations are not trapped and there's a more streamlined path. And maybe there are things that we could do as an industry that we're not doing to facilitate and sort of unclog some of that pipeline.
Sometimes I wonder, having worked in the bio space a little while, if the gold at the end of the rainbow is just a little bit greater over in that space too. If to some degree, that's why things don't get trapped over there, because they know at the end of the day, the reward may be much higher than the reward in the medical technology space. And that's the way investors might think about academic centers too, in the biopharma space versus in the medtech space. Do you think there's anything to that?
Right. Oh yeah, no, I think you hit on one of the issues. There's just more and easier capital to be applied to biopharma innovations, and medtech's been a bit of an ugly duckling in that regard, right? You're right; it's higher rewards. Certainly, we might argue that at some certain aspects or certain sectors within our certainly in diagnostics and in digital health, there have been some pretty good exits there, but it's also higher risk. That's maybe the message we need to get across, which is that for every molecule that gets out of phase 1 or phase 2, the number, it's not just higher risk, it is a hard binary risk that if the p-value on your phase 3 study is 0.08, you're in trouble. If it's 0.04, you have $1 billion product. I mean, for some reason, either they're communicating it differently or somehow the investor community sort of gets that and understands that risk reward. And maybe we need to do, there are things we could do to improve on that. But I think you're right. Lack of capital is part of the problem. More difficult access to capital is part of the problem on that.
It's a fascinating thing. We've heard so many of our CEOs talk about the importance of the entire medtech ecosystem, right? From the earliest stage, as you mentioned, in the academic center and the concept stage, through the regulatory process, and then into the payment space as well. Right. And Lishan, we've worked on this a little bit as well, but talk about that end of it, the payment side. We've talked about MCIT and whether that was the perfect solution or a step in the right direction, but it still feels like also in that space, more clarity on the payer side of medical technology innovation could give us a little more certainty on how we invest on the front end. Do you agree with that?
I completely agree with that. I mean, there are risks along the way. There's technology risk, there's IP risk, there's regulatory risk. None of those systems are perfect. The way we do IP is not perfect. The way we handle regulatory, but as much as the FDA has gotten a lot better on that, as thanks to this organization, we can get through. There's predictability. Generally pretty good predictability on that, and predictability is the key to being able to raise capital. The one area where things are very difficult. If you're not a big sort of large behemoth company, it's very difficult to manage reimbursement risk. I would definitely put that at the top. You'll appreciate this from your days on the Hill, but I always get a chuckle every time I read about the objection to the prescription to Medicare negotiating prescription.
Part D.
I'm thinking okay, fine. There are plenty of arguments pro and con, and I can understand the con arguments, but that's what we deal with every day. We got payment for our diagnostic for Medicare. We dealt with the Medicare contractors. Sure, the contractors have their own, but at the end of the day, we have to work within this current system to secure reimbursement. And MCIT and structures along that line where technologies, we have a breakthrough technology in Lucid, EsoGuard, the molecular diagnostic assay, that is ultimately going to be dependent on the breakthrough designation resulting in some predictability during a period of time when we're able to collect post-market data to demonstrate the value in various populations and including the Medicare population. And that's what it comes down to, is it comes down to predictability. Right now, you could end up, waiting 18 months for a draft LCD like we're doing on one of our assays, or things can move quickly. And again, if you have, if you're a larger company, you could absorb that predictability. Smaller companies, it can be existential, frankly.
Yeah, that's
and it can be the difference between getting a life-saving, innovative technology into the hands of physicians for patients and not.
It's hard to find the example of a life-saving biotech pharma product that didn't get immediate coverage and broad immediate coverage, right? Correct. And a message like that sends a strong message to an investor, right, of the predictability on the risk that they made, right? And if we don't have that certainty on our end, it just continues to make it more challenging, in my opinion. We obviously agree on this. We really need to fix that.
And I think it's the number one. If there's one thing we need to fix in the life cycle of getting an innovation out of the innovators and into the hands of physicians, there's one thing we need to fix is how we do reimbursement. I think that's the highest risk area right now.
Let me transition a little bit then to policy and politics. I don't want to get into a conversation about politics, Lishan, because
we've had a few over beers. That's
regardless of what you say, you will lose half the audience. That's what we've learned in recent years, right? So we will not talk about parties or specific individuals. But in making the case, talk about how important it is, right, to have access to policymakers in order to make the case as to how we need to shape the ecosystem to have good outcomes for patients. Oftentimes, people don't really maybe understand the benefit of that dialogue, and it's challenging, right? But it's important to have, regardless of party.
I think what I'll start answering a question about a little bit about what I've learned about AdvaMed over the, because this is basically one and the same with my recent experience of getting more involved in AdvaMed and what it means to be an advocacy organization on behalf of an industry. So I remember AdvaMed when I was a resident. I think Mike Masalam was the head at the time, I think, where for us, AdvaMed was, can the companies pay for the dinner that I'm entitled to because I've been working 100 hours a week and I've got a rep. I've got a rep who's taking me out for a steak dinner, right? That's all I really do about AdvaMed for years. And it's been amazing over the last couple of years of getting more involved and now being on the board for me to see lobbying and advocacy just sort of generically to the average person is perceived as being, maybe for good reason for other sectors and other industries, I don't know, but perceived as being a bit of a dirty game, a bit of a sort of, we're going to watch out for our interests at the expense potentially of others. And maybe this is the same aspect of, we're in an industry that is doing good, and ultimately, yes, it's a business. We're looking, people need to make money, and there needs to be a profit underlying it. But maybe it's the core of our business. But I've been amazed at not only how important the advocacy work is and the policy, having access to policymakers and to legislators to advance it, but how that work is really driven by the same fundamental core mission of allowing us to be in a position to be, that's ultimately in the best interest of our ultimate clients, which are patients. I didn't expect that. I really am quite amazed at how coherent that effort is and how well it aligns with that. So you asked about getting in touch with, having access to policymakers. What we do is complicated. These diseases are complicated. I might even say more complicated than on the biopharma side, where yes, the chemistry and the biology of the specific therapeutic may be complicated, the disease might be complicated, but at the end of the day, you're just administering a pill or you're administering some IV or something. I think for people to understand the implications of policy changes on the work that we do and how it can help or hinder our ability to take innovations and advance them into clinical use for the benefit of patients. It's a difficult thing to be. It's not easy to explain that. I'm obviously that, but I'm just saying that for the broader audience. So having access and having the ability to explain to folks, what a medical device tax sounds great. It's another way to raise money, and fine, but what the actual impact of that is what would have been, or maybe was during when it was in play, and the successful effort to eliminate that. And, obviously we're doing that with MSIT. We're doing that on a variety of other fronts. So I couldn't be more impressed and happy and to be a part of an organization that just seems to do that right. So.
I appreciate you saying that. And we're grateful for you taking time to do it with us, because it's one thing for me to go in and tell the story of MedTech, even to tell the story of patients, right? It's one thing for me to tell that story and my team to tell it. It's different when you come in and sit down with a member of Congress or a regulator or the president or the secretary of HHS, and you give them an understanding of what it took from your first idea until approval to get that product to a patient. And, the other thing I've found, Lishan, is so often a member of Congress or a politician might not understand it until they've experienced it, until they've experienced the technology, they or a family member, and all of a sudden then the light goes on. Oh, right. And they really want to dig into it. And when you hit that moment, it can be transformative in policy outcomes.
And again, there are solutions that are fiscally responsible, that make sense, that work, but that are well-informed. The issue is having well-informed policies that are really based on the substance of the details and the nuances of what we do every day. And I think, we have a really good operation in getting that across.
Yeah. Let me come back to one thing you said early on in the conversation, and I'll have two more questions for you. But you mentioned early on when you were a young heart surgeon that diversity in that space wasn't as great as it is today. That's been an important issue, not I'm sure for you, Lishan, but for all of us in recent years, right? How can we increase diversity in all aspects of life, but particularly in our space, right? In the medtech space. What have you seen? How have you seen that improve over the years, and where else do we need to go?
I'll give you a quick story, and then I'll tell you, I think we have seen improvements and what that is and where we would go. So you back that anecdote that I mentioned to you. So I was always, it was a male-dominated field, but I was in almost every scenario was the only minority person in the room, typically. And it's interesting. Right around the time I started, a couple of colleagues decided to form the Black Cardiothoracic Surgeons Association within a sort of, a group of Black cardiothoracic surgeons. And the most amazing thing is the first time we had a meeting, we all looked around. I was like, wait a second, I didn't know there were that many. I didn't realize there were that many of us, because we had kind of plodded through the system, thinking that we were, and it was not sufficient, but getting everybody in a room. So, there's certainly been progress made. I would say the progress in medicine and in the industry, not necessarily the same, has been greater on gender than with regard to ethnicity. Cardiac surgery is still a fairly male-dominated specialty, but that's changing. There are very few remain, even within surgery, that are sort of male special, have always been considered male specialties. But we haven't made a lot of progress on diversity at the, underrepresented minority level. I think what we have made, the progress that we've made, is not necessarily in the numbers, although there's been some. I don't mean to say there hasn't been any, there's been some. The progress, absolutely clear-cut progress that's been made, has been in the conversation and the fact that we talk about it and it's front and center. And that I think, you remember when you wrote the letter after the George Floyd summer and sort of this whole, sort of racial reckoning that was going on, and how absolutely amazed I was that corporate entities and corporate, trade associations were actually talking about these issues in a way that we have never talked about before.
Yeah.
So that's the most important thing, is that the dialogue is there. We're talking about it, but now we need to sort of translate that into actual results. And I'm sure hopefully you've bragged about this on other podcasts. But again, another thing that I have found, very impressive is the efforts that AdvaMed has taken in this regard. We have a diversity and inclusion subcommittee of the board. We have a team. We have CEO group. Jen and Martha and others have been leading the charge on that. And we've made the assessments as to how we're doing, and it's clear that we could do better. And I'll move on for this. But the one thing that struck me that I hadn't thought about before, which I like about the way we're couching this initiative, is that the industry should reflect the patients that we're taking care of, which is a little different twist than, let's say, some other Silicon Valley company or something, where that's not really as, although there's certain aspects of that as well. And I think that's a real anchor to this effort, right? The whole point is to have, because by doing so, we're going to do right by those patients, because we'll have, better understanding of their experiences by having a more diverse and inclusive workforce.
Yeah, I've said it this way before. Not only is it the right thing to do morally and ethically, but it's the right thing to do from a business standpoint too, right? Yeah. And when all three of those align, you're set to make progress. And I think that's what we're trying to really continue to press on. And we have to keep doing it, because as you and I have talked about it, I tend to get a little more frustrated with conversations that don't end, right? I'm kind of anxious to see what's the progress. Let's get on with the work, right? But it's good to hear you say the importance of those conversations and continuing being important as well. And so that's encouraging.
Yeah, you can't get to the results unless you actually are talking about the same thing and you're talking about it. Then you don't want to be talking endlessly about it. It's like, what are we going to do? How are we going to get that? What are the metrics? What are we going to do? Why is it beneficial? The one person I should have mentioned was Kevin Lobo, because Kevin was the chair, the inaugural chair when I joined. Right. And as you know, obviously but hopefully others know, that he made it front and center for his tenure as chair. And I remember hearing one of his talks very early on about exactly what you said, which is that this is good for business. Let me show you how in my own business, my large medtech corporation, how we did this and how it's actually had a positive impact on our bottom line, not just because it's socially the right thing to do.
Well, I'm excited about the progress we're making, and we're committed to continuing that. Let me close with this question, because there are a lot of younger executives who listen to this podcast, and a lot of small company executives as well, who might want to follow your path, or they've been inspired by your story today. If you could boil down in just a couple of minutes some advice that you would give those who are coming out of Harvard, or they're surgeons right now and they're thinking about getting into this space, what advice would you give the younger generation about following in your footsteps?
It's a tough question. I think I would, start by saying focus on the right things, always be grounded in what we've talked about repeatedly during the podcast, which is focusing on the patients and the importance and the value of what you're accomplishing. So that's number one. The second is to really understand and become a student of the industry and the processes. You really get to know, call people like me up who kind of did it and made all the, others who've made all the mistakes, along the way, and entered this with some naivete. But the quicker an innovator or someone who aspires to lead in this field can really understand the nitty-gritty of what we talked about. What does it take to actually advance the technology? What does the R&D phase look like? I've reviewed, helped sort of advise budding entrepreneurs and realized that they did an entire body of work without a design history file. So that all of that work is going to have to ultimately be repeated. So just getting that, understanding IP, understanding reimbursement, understanding all of that, the entire trajectory along the way, and becoming a student of that is really important. And then it boils down to, I guess, three things: just sort of grit, perseverance, hard work, but building a team. I mean, that's, we certainly, identifying people who are going to be alongside you along the way through ups and downs, and multiple times where you end up staring in the abyss, which we've done. And then it comes down to capital, and just understanding how the capital infrastructure works and how to raise capital in a way that will get you to there. Because without capital, you could have the greatest idea, it could be life-saving, it could have a big impact, you could have a great team. And that's why we're so fortunate at PAVmed now that we're in a position where we've kind of gotten over the hump on that and can do the things that we think we need to do and want to do along the way.
Well, that's great advice for everyone who's listening and for me as well. So thanks for joining us today, talking with us about your career journey and your advice for others. I've enjoyed it, and I'm sure everyone who's listening to this will enjoy it as well. So thanks for joining us.
Real pleasure, Scott. Really enjoyed it. Thanks so much.
All right. Good. Have a great day. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Medtech POV. For more information and to subscribe to our podcast, go to advamed.org/podcast. You can also subscribe through your favorite streaming platform. We hope you'll join us for the next episode of Medtech POV.